This is Article 5. Not the document itself, that sits in a vault in Brussels, but the words, printed on a single sheet of paper. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. 29 words that have defined European security for 75 years. 29 words that Russia has spent 3 years learning to work around. The assumption embedded in Western strategy is that these words create a bright red line, a threshold that, once crossed, triggers automatic military response from the world's most powerful alliance. The assumption is wrong. Article 5 is not automatic. It requires unanimous agreement among 32 member states that an attack has occurred, that the attack warrants collective response, and that each nation will contribute to that response as it deems necessary. That language, as it deems necessary, is the gap through which Russia has been driving its strategy since February 2022. And on January 19, 2026, that gap became wide enough to fit an army through. At 4:30 a.m. Eastern European Time, Russian forces conducted what Moscow called a border security operation against a logistics hub in Suwalki, Lithuania, a facility used to transfer Western military equipment to Ukraine. The operation lasted 47 minutes. 14 Lithuanian soldiers were killed. The facility was destroyed. Russian forces withdrew to Kaliningrad before dawn. NATO's response, issued 18 hours later, condemned the provocative action and announced enhanced defensive measures along the eastern flank. Article 5 was not invoked. The alliance that was supposed to guarantee collective defense instead issued a press release. This is not failure. This is the exposure of a design flaw that Russia has understood for years and the West has refused to acknowledge. Here's what they're not telling you. NATO's deterrence model assumes that any attack on member territory triggers escalation to a level Russia cannot accept, up to and including nuclear confrontation. The model assumes Russia is deterred because Russia knows that crossing the threshold means war with the entire alliance, a war Russia cannot win. The assumption contains a logical gap. It requires Russia to believe that NATO will actually escalate, and Russia has spent 3 years testing whether that belief is justified. The tests have been incremental. Russian aircraft violating Baltic airspace, hundreds of incidents annually, each one technically an armed intrusion, each one met with protests rather than shoot-downs. Russian ships entering territorial waters of NATO members, documented, condemned, unpunished. Cyber attacks on NATO infrastructure, attributed, denounced, consequence-free. Sabotage of undersea cables and pipelines, investigated, blamed, unanswered. Each test that doesn't trigger Article 5 recalibrates Russian understanding of where the actual line sits. The written line says any armed attack. The revealed line says something different. Attacks that can be characterized as ambiguous, limited, or deniable do not trigger collective response, regardless of what the treaty text says. The Suwalki operation was the logical extension of this learning. Russia attacked NATO territory, killed NATO soldiers, and destroyed NATO-related infrastructure. The attack was neither ambiguous nor deniable. Russian forces wore Russian uniforms and announced the operation on state television within hours. But the attack was limited. 47 minutes, a single target, immediate withdrawal. At 9:15 a.m. Brussels time on January 19th, the North Atlantic Council convened an emergency session. The session lasted 11 hours. No transcript has been released, but sources present described fundamental disagreement over whether the operation constituted an armed attack under Article 5 or a limited incursion that warranted response short of collective defense. The disagreement broke along predictable lines. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia demanded immediate Article 5 invocation. Germany, France, Italy, and Spain argued for proportionate response that avoided escalation. The United States reportedly advocated a middle position, enhanced deterrence without collective defense activation, that satisfied no one but prevented deadlock. The 18-hour delay between the attack and NATO's response was not bureaucratic processing time. It was negotiation time, the time required to find language that preserved alliance unity without committing to actions that major members refused to take. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. NATO's credibility rests on the assumption that Article 5 is automatic, that the question of whether to respond is settled in advance by the treaty commitment. The Suwalki response revealed that the question is not settled. It is negotiated in real time, under pressure, with the attacking party watching to see how the negotiation unfolds. The negotiation dynamics favor the attacker. Russia can calibrate its actions based on observed Western responses. NATO cannot calibrate its response without first achieving consensus among 32 nations with divergent threat perceptions, military capabilities, and domestic political constraints. Germany's position illustrates the constraint. Chancellor Friedrich Merz faces an electorate that supports Ukraine rhetorically, but opposes military escalation materially. Polling shows 67% of Germans oppose any action that risks direct conflict with Russia. Invoking Article 5 for a 47-minute operation in Lithuania, however legally justified, would require Merz to explain why German soldiers should now be committed to potential combat over a facility that was destroyed and a threat that has withdrawn. France's position reflects different constraints. President Marine Le Pen's government views NATO as an American-dominated structure that subordinates European interests to Washington's priorities. Invoking Article 5 for an attack that didn't target France, didn't threaten France, and didn't require French response serves American interests in containing Russia, while exposing France to risks it didn't choose. Italy's position is shaped by energy dependency that sanctions have not eliminated, and economic ties that diplomatic pressure has not severed. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's coalition includes parties that openly advocate for rapprochement with Moscow. Article 5 invocation would fracture a governing coalition that prioritizes domestic stability over alliance obligations. Each nation's calculus is rational within its own frame. The collective result is an alliance that cannot act decisively, because decisive action requires unanimous commitment that divergent interests prevent. Russia understands this arithmetic. The Suwalki operation was sized precisely to fall within the gap, large enough to demonstrate capability, limited enough to give reluctant members grounds for non-escalation. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. The aftermath of the Suwalki operation has produced a response architecture that reveals more than it conceals. On January 21st, NATO announced the deployment of an additional 4,000 troops to the Baltic states and Poland, a deterrence reinforcement that brings total eastern flank presence to approximately 40,000. The deployment was framed as demonstrating resolve. The number demonstrates the opposite. 40,000 troops cannot defend against a Russian military that maintains 200,000 personnel within striking distance of NATO's eastern border. The deployment is a tripwire, not a defense. Its purpose is to ensure that any Russian offensive would kill American, British, German, and French soldiers, making non-response politically impossible. But tripwires only work if the attacker believes the wire will trigger the explosion. Russia has just watched NATO fail to trigger collective defense for an attack that killed 14 Lithuanian soldiers. The credibility of the tripwire has been tested and found wanting. On January 22nd, the United States announced acceleration of military aid to Ukraine, including weapon systems previously withheld. The announcement was framed as supporting Ukrainian defense. It was actually compensation, an attempt to demonstrate commitment through proxy support when direct alliance response proved impossible. The message to Moscow: we will not invoke Article 5, but we will increase the cost of your Ukraine operation. The message Russia received: NATO's actual red line is not its border. NATO's actual red line is somewhere beyond its border, in a location that remains undefined and apparently negotiable. Less than 72 hours after the attack, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave an interview in which he described the operation as necessary counterterrorism against illegal weapons trafficking, and noted that Russia has no intention of threatening NATO members who respect international law. The framing was brazenly dishonest. NATO military assistance to Ukraine violates no international law, but the subtext was clear. Russia will define which NATO activities justify Russian response, and NATO has demonstrated it will not enforce its own definition of unacceptable aggression. The interview ended with a statement that Western analysts are still parsing. Russia's security requirements extend to the prevention of threats, not merely the response to attacks. Responsible NATO members understand this. Responsible NATO members means members who might be persuaded to break alliance consensus. The phrase is an invitation to defection, broadcast publicly, after NATO demonstrated that defection is possible without consequence. While one side fractures, the other side probes. Russia's strategy following Suwalki has shifted from testing to exploitation. On January 23rd, Russian naval vessels conducted exercises in the Baltic Sea that brought them within 12 nautical miles of Swedish territorial waters. Legal under international law, but provocative given Sweden's recent NATO accession. The exercises included simulated missile launches toward targets whose coordinates correspond to Swedish naval facilities. The Swedish government protested through diplomatic channels. NATO's response was a statement expressing concern about destabilizing activities. No ships were repositioned, no aircraft were scrambled. The pattern established at Suwalki, condemnation without consequence, continued. On January 24th, Russian cyber operations targeted electrical grid infrastructure in Estonia, causing localized outages affecting 40,000 households for approximately 6 hours. Estonian authorities attributed the attack to Russian state actors within 3 hours. NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, located in Tallinn, issued an assessment calling the attack consistent with Russian hybrid warfare doctrine. Cyber attacks exist in a gray zone that NATO has never clearly defined as Article 5 triggers. The 2014 Wales Summit declared that cyber attacks could trigger collective defense. The 2016 Warsaw Summit affirmed cyber as an operational domain. Neither statement committed to automatic response. The ambiguity was intentional, providing flexibility while maintaining deterrence. Russia is now testing whether the ambiguity provides more flexibility than deterrence. 6 hours of power outages in winter conditions could have caused deaths if sustained longer or targeted differently. The attack demonstrated capability and willingness. The response demonstrated that capability and willingness are insufficient to trigger alliance action. On January 25th, Russian forces in Belarus conducted a mobilization exercise that brought 35,000 troops to positions within 20 kilometers of the Polish border. The exercise was announced 12 hours before it began, technically compliant with OSCE notification requirements, but clearly designed to maximize psychological pressure. Polish President Andrzej Duda requested emergency NATO consultations. The consultations produced agreement on enhanced vigilance, but no troop movements, no forward deployment changes, and no alteration to rules of engagement. The alliance that claims to guarantee Polish security responded to 35,000 Russian troops massing on Poland's border with a statement of concern. The pattern is now established. Russia can conduct limited attacks on NATO territory, conduct provocative military exercises near NATO borders, execute cyber attacks against NATO infrastructure, and mass troops in threatening postures, all without triggering the collective defense mechanism that NATO's deterrence model assumes is automatic. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. NATO's structural constraints create a predictable response pattern that Russia can exploit indefinitely. Constraint 1. Unanimity requirement. Article 5 invocation requires unanimous agreement. Any single member can prevent collective defense by refusing consent. Russia doesn't need to deter NATO. It needs to deter 32 nations, knowing that deterring any one of them is sufficient. Constraint 2. Domestic political accountability. NATO leaders face electorates that support alliance membership abstractly, but oppose specific military actions concretely. Poll numbers consistently show that majorities in Western Europe oppose military response to scenarios that don't directly threaten their territory. Leaders who invoke Article 5 for other people's problems face electoral punishment. Constraint 3. Escalation fear. The ultimate backstop of NATO deterrence is nuclear, the assumption that Russia won't risk actions that could escalate to nuclear exchange. But this fear is bidirectional. Western leaders are equally afraid of escalation. An alliance that is afraid to escalate faces an adversary that can calibrate aggression to stay below whatever threshold triggers the fear. Russia's strategy exploits all three constraints simultaneously. Actions are sized to give reluctant members grounds for non-response. Unanimity constraint. Actions are targeted at small states that large state electorates don't prioritize. Domestic constraint. Actions are limited enough that escalation seems disproportionate. Fear constraint. The trap is that NATO cannot resolve these constraints without fundamental restructuring that no member has proposed. Eliminating unanimity would require treaty revision that members won't accept. Changing domestic politics would require threat perception shifts that haven't occurred. Overcoming escalation fear would require accepting risks that democratic governments cannot explain to their populations. Russia can probe indefinitely because NATO's response architecture is fixed, while Russia's tactics are adaptive. Each probe that doesn't trigger response expands the space for the next probe. The alliance is being defeated in slow motion by an adversary that has learned to lose every battle while winning the war. This is what a system looks like when the design assumptions no longer match the operational environment. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Defense contractor stocks in Eastern Europe have surged 34% since January 19th, while Western European defense stocks have risen only 12%. The divergence reflects market assessment that Eastern Europe faces threats that Western Europe will not fully share. Credit default swap spreads on Baltic sovereign debt have widened to levels not seen since 2014, reflecting investor assessment that security guarantees may not translate to security outcomes. The bond market is pricing in scenarios that official statements don't acknowledge. Capital flight from Baltic banking systems has accelerated, with deposit outflows of approximately €4 billion since January 19th. Wealthy individuals and businesses are repositioning assets to jurisdictions that seem more secure, a revealed preference that contradicts stated confidence in NATO protection. Gold purchases at Eastern European dealers have spiked 200% in 1 week, with the largest increases in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. The purchases are concentrated in portable denominations, the kind people buy when they're not sure their country will remain stable. Real estate prices in border regions of Poland and the Baltic states have fallen 15 to 20% since the Suwałki attack, while prices in interior regions have risen. The market is pricing in geography that security policy pretends doesn't matter. The question is not whether NATO's deterrence model has been exposed as flawed. The question is, who understands that flaw well enough to act on its implications? 29 words in a treaty signed 75 years ago. A collective defense commitment that has never been tested against a nuclear-armed adversary willing to probe. And a gap between written obligation and revealed response that grows wider with each incident that demonstrates it exists. This is not alliance management. This is alliance erosion. The gradual discovery that mutual defense requires mutual willingness, and willingness cannot be guaranteed by treaty text. Physics doesn't negotiate. Political will doesn't appear because documents say it should. And reality, eventually, asserts itself over every security guarantee that assumed commitment would materialize when tested. The divergence between NATO's stated red lines and NATO's revealed red lines is now visible to everyone watching. What happens next is not prediction, it's calibration. Russia measuring exactly how far it can go, while the answer keeps changing in its favor.